A boy with nothing, a rancher with everything to lose. One decision that would defy the law and rewrite both their lives. If you've ever believed that family isn't just blood, but the people who choose to stay when the world walks away, then this story is for you. Stay until the end to see how one question in a barn doorway became a bond that no law could break. And please hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The Montana wind had teeth that morning. It came off the northern ridge in sharp gusts, carrying the smell of pine and early frost, rattling the weathered boards of the barn and stirring dust devils across the empty yard. Silas Crow stood at the fence line, one boot propped on the lower rail, his eyes narrowed against the light as he surveyed the western pasture. The cattle were restless, shifting in tight clusters near the creek bed. He'd need to move them before the week turned cold. He didn't hear the boy approach. That alone should have told him something. Silas had spent 15 years alone on this land, and silence had become his companion. He knew the sound of every creak in the floorboards, every gust through the eaves. He could tell the difference between a coyote's step and a deer's, but this boy, thin as a rail, dark-haired, no older than 12, had crossed 50 yards of open ground without making a sound. Silas turned and found him standing just outside the barn door, hands loose at his sides, face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat 2 sizes too large. The boy didn't flinch, didn't shuffle his feet or drop his gaze. He just stood there, waiting, like he'd been taught to wait a long time for things that might never come. "You lost?" Silas asked, his voice rough from disuse. "No, sir." "Then what are you doing on my land?" The boy's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed level. "Looking for work." Silas let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried any humor. He turned back to the fence, shaking his head. "I don't need help. You've got 40 head of cattle, a barn that needs new shingles, and a fence line running east that's sagging in 3 places," the boy said quietly. "I can work." Silas went still. He turned slowly, studying the boy more carefully this time. The kid's clothes were threadbare but clean, patched at the elbows and knees. His boots were scuffed nearly smooth, the leather cracked but intact. There was no horse, no pack, no sign of where he'd come from or how far he'd traveled. But his shoulders were square, his hands calloused, and his eyes, those eyes held something older than 12 years should carry. "What's your name?" "Noah Reed." "Where's your family, Noah Reed?" The boy's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that looked like a door closing. "Gone." Silas knew that tone. He'd used it himself more times than he could count. It was the tone of someone who'd learned that the fewer words you gave, the fewer questions followed. He glanced past the boy toward the road, half expecting to see someone coming after him. But the road was empty, just dust and distance stretching toward the horizon. "You run away from someone?" "No, sir." "You running toward something?" Noah hesitated, then shook his head. "Just running." Silas turned back to the pasture, his hands gripping the rail. He should send the boy on his way, should point him toward town, toward the church, toward anyone who wasn't a man who'd spent the last decade and a half trying to forget what it felt like to care about another living soul. But something in the set of the boy's shoulders, in the quiet dignity of his posture, made Silas pause. "You know how to muck a stall?" "Yes, sir." "Fix a fence?" "Yes, sir." "Handle a horse without spooking it?" "Yes, sir." Silas exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. "One night. You can sleep in the loft, breakfast at dawn. If you can keep up for a day's work, I'll feed you supper. After that, you move on. Understood?" "Understood." The boy didn't smile, didn't thank him, didn't show relief. He just nodded once and turned toward the barn, moving with the same quiet efficiency he'd arrived with. Silas watched him go, a knot of unease settling in his chest. He told himself it was just one night. One day. Then the boy would be gone, and things would go back to the way they'd been. But even then, standing in the cold wind with the taste of regret already on his tongue, Silas knew he was lying to himself. The boy was awake before the sun. Silas heard him moving in the loft as the first gray light crept through the windows, the soft scrape of boots on wood, the rustle of hay. By the time Silas had the stove lit and coffee brewing, Noah was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, hat in hand, waiting for permission to enter. Sit, Silas said, nodding toward the table. Noah sat without a word, his movements careful, controlled. Silas set a plate in front of him, eggs, bacon, bread toasted over the stove, and the boy stared at it for a moment like he wasn't sure what to do. Then he picked up his fork and ate in silence, methodical and unhurried, finishing every bite without leaving a scrap. Silas poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying the boy over the rim. You always this quiet? You want me to talk? I'm asking if you know how. Noah's mouth twitched, almost a smile. I know how. Then why don't you? The boy set down his fork, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. People don't usually want to hear what I have to say. Silas grunted, turning back to the stove. Fair enough. They worked through the morning in near silence, the kind of silence that came from two people who understood the rhythm of labor. Noah moved through the tasks Silas set for him with a precision that spoke of experience, mucking stalls, hauling water, mending a broken gate hinge. He didn't ask for help, didn't complain, didn't stop to rest. He just worked, steady and unrelenting, until Silas finally called a halt at midday. They ate lunch on the porch, cold chicken, bread, apples from the cellar. Noah sat on the top step, his back straight, his eyes on the distant mountains. Silas watched him from the rocking chair, the silence stretching between them like a rope pulled taut. You planning to tell me where you came from? Silas asked. Noah took a bite of his apple, chewing slowly. Does it matter? Might. The boy was quiet for a long moment, then shrugged. Came from the east. Been moving west for a while now. Alone? Mostly. And before that? Noah's jaw tightened. Before that doesn't matter anymore. Silas recognized the wall when he saw it. He'd built enough of them himself. He leaned back in the chair, letting it creak beneath his weight, and let the subject drop. They finished their meal in silence, and when Noah stood to head back to the barn, Silas didn't stop him. But he didn't send him away, either. One day turned into two. Two turned into a week. Silas told himself it was practical. The boy was a good worker, better than most men twice his age. He didn't waste time, didn't shirk, didn't need to be told twice. The fence line got mended, the barn got patched, the cattle got moved to fresh pasture without incident, and at the end of each day, Noah climbed back into the loft without asking if he could stay another night. Silas didn't offer, but he didn't turn him out either. The routine settled between them like dust after a storm, unspoken, inevitable. Breakfast before dawn, work until dusk, supper in silence. Then Noah would disappear into the loft, and Silas would sit alone in the house, listening to the creak of the floorboards overhead and wondering what the hell he was doing. He'd lost his wife and daughter to fever 8 years ago, buried them on the hill overlooking the creek where wildflowers grew in the spring. He'd built this ranch with his own hands, carved it out of hard ground and harder winters. And he'd done it alone because alone was safer. Alone didn't ask questions. Alone didn't need him. Alone didn't leave. But Noah wasn't asking for anything. That was the problem. The boy worked for his keep, ate what he was given, and never once asked Silas for more than a place to sleep and a day's work. He didn't pry, didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. He just existed, quiet and steady, like a shadow that had learned to carry its own weight. And Silas, against every instinct that told him to keep his distance, found himself noticing things. The way Noah's hands shook when he thought no one was looking. The way he ate like every meal might be his last. The way he flinched, just slightly, when Silas raised his voice to call the dog. The way he stood watch over the horses at night, as if he were guarding something precious from an enemy only he could see. It was the watching that got to Silas the most. One evening, 2 weeks after Noah had arrived, Silas stepped into the barn to find the boy sitting in the hayloft with his back against the wall, a knife in one hand and a piece of wood in the other. He was carving something, his movements slow and deliberate, shavings falling like snow onto the floor below. "What are you making?" Silas asked, leaning against the ladder. Noah glanced down, then back at the wood. "Nothing. Just passing time." "Let me see." The boy hesitated, then climbed down and handed over the carving. It was a horse, half finished but already recognizable, the curve of the neck, the arch of the back, the delicate lines of the legs. Silas turned it over in his hands, surprised by the detail, the care. "You're good at this." Noah shrugged. Had a lot of time to practice. Where'd you learn? My father. It was the first time the boy had mentioned his family without being asked. Silas handed the carving back, his voice careful. He's still around? Noah's expression went flat, the door slamming shut again. No. Silas didn't push. He just nodded and turned to leave, but Noah's voice stopped him at the barn door. Mr. Crow? Silas looked back. Yeah? Thank you for letting me stay. The words were quiet, but they hit like a fist to the chest. Silas stood there for a moment, searching for something to say, then settled on the truth. You've earned it. Noah's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction, and Silas walked back to the house with the weight of those two words pressing down on him like stones. 3 weeks in, the boy got sick. It started with a cough, dry, rattling, the kind that came from sleeping in a cold loft with only a thin blanket. Silas heard it one morning and found Noah doubled over in the barn, one hand braced against the wall, his face pale and slick with sweat. You're burning up, Silas said, pressing the back of his hand to the boy's forehead. I'm fine. Like hell you are. Noah tried to stand, but his legs buckled, and Silas caught him before he hit the ground. The boy weighed next to nothing, all bone and gristle, and Silas carried him into the house without a word, ignoring the feeble protests. He put Noah in the spare room, the one that had been his daughter's, untouched for 8 years, and piled blankets over him until the shivering stopped. Then he brewed willow bark tea, forced the boy to drink it, and sat in the chair by the window, watching the rise and fall of Noah's chest. The fever broke 2 days later. Silas had stayed close the entire time, checking the boy's temperature, changing the blankets, making sure he drank enough water. He told himself it was just responsibility. Anyone would do the same for a sick kid. But when Noah finally opened his eyes, his voice hoarse and uncertain, and asked, "Why are you helping me?" Silas didn't have an answer. "Because you needed it," he said finally. Noah stared at him, those sharp eyes searching for something Silas couldn't name. Then he nodded and closed his eyes again, his breathing evening out into sleep. Silas sat there a while longer, listening to the quiet, and realized with a sinking certainty that the boy wasn't leaving. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Maybe not ever. And for the first time in 8 years, the thought didn't terrify him. By the end of the first month, the ranch had changed. Not in any way Silas could point to exactly. The fences were mended, the barn was patched, the cattle were healthy, but there was something different in the air, something that felt like the ghost of warmth returning to a place that had gone cold. Noah still didn't talk much, but he'd started asking questions. Small ones at first, about the land, the cattle, the best way to shoe a horse. Then bigger ones, about Silas's past, about how he'd built the ranch, about what it had been like before. Silas answered when he could, keeping his words short and his walls high. But the boy had a way of listening that made it hard to lie, even by omission. He didn't pry, didn't judge, didn't fill the silence with platitudes. He just listened, and somehow that was worse than any question. One evening, they were sitting on the porch after supper, the sky streaked with red and gold as the sun dipped below the mountains. Noah was carving again, his hands moving with that same quiet precision, and Silas was nursing a cup of coffee, letting the day's aches settle into his bones. "Mr. Crow?" Noah said, not looking up from his work. "Yeah?" "Do you ever think about leaving?" Silas frowned. "Leaving where?" "Here. The ranch. All of it." "Why would I do that?" Noah shrugged, still carving. "I don't know. Just seems like it might be lonely sometimes." Silas stared at the boy, the words sitting heavy between them. He wanted to say that he'd chosen this, that he preferred the silence, that loneliness was just another part of the landscape. But the lie stuck in his throat, because Noah was sitting right there, proof that the walls Silas had built weren't as solid as he'd thought. "It was," Silas said quietly. "For a long time it was." Noah glanced up, his eyes steady. "And now?" Silas met his gaze, and for the first time in years he let the truth show. "Now it's different." The boy nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, and went back to his carving. Silas drained his coffee and stood, heading inside before the knot in his chest could tighten any further. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind outside, he knew the truth. The boy had cracked something open in him, something he'd thought was buried for good. And now there was no putting it back. Amen. It was a Tuesday when the men came. Silas was out in the pasture, checking the herd, when he saw the dust cloud rising on the road. 2 riders, moving fast. He straightened, shading his eyes against the sun, and felt the first prickle of unease crawl up his spine. Noah was in the barn, cleaning tack. Silas called out to him as he headed back toward the house, his voice sharp. "Noah, get inside." The boy appeared in the doorway, his face wary. "What's wrong?" "Just do it." Noah hesitated, then disappeared into the house. Silas reached the porch just as the riders pulled up, their horses lathered and blowing hard. Both men were dressed in town clothes, dark coats, clean hats, boots polished despite the dust. One of them dismounted, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. The other stayed in the saddle, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. "Mr. Crow?" the thin man said, his voice clipped and precise. "That's right, my name is Samuel Pritchard. I'm with the Territorial Land Office. This is Deputy Lang. We're here on official business." Silas crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "What kind of business?" Pritchard opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers, unfolding them with crisp efficiency. "We've been informed that you're harboring a minor child without legal guardianship, a boy by the name of Noah Reed." Silas's blood went cold. "Who told you that?" "That's not relevant. What is relevant is that the boy is required to be placed under the supervision of the territorial authority until his legal status can be determined." "His legal status?" Silas repeated, his voice flat. "Yes. There are questions regarding his father's estate, land holdings in the eastern territories that were never properly settled. The boy is a potential heir, and as such, he must be placed in protective custody until the matter is resolved." Silas's hands curled into fists. "Protective custody." "Correct. And where exactly would he be going?" Pritchard glanced at the deputy, then back at Silas. "That will be determined by the court. For now, he'll be taken to a holding facility in Helena." "A holding facility," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You mean a jail?" "It's a temporary measure. He's 12 years old. Which is precisely why the law requires intervention, Mr. Crow. Now, if you'll bring the boy out, we can settle this matter without further complication." Silas didn't move. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of the door, and then Noah's voice, small but steady. "I'm here." Silas turned. The boy was standing in the doorway, his face pale but composed, his hands loose at his sides. He looked at Silas, then at the men on horseback, and something flickered in his eyes, something that looked like resignation. "Noah," Silas said, his voice rough. "Go back inside." "It's all right," Noah said quietly. "I knew they'd come eventually." Pritchard stepped forward, his expression almost sympathetic. "Son, we're not here to hurt you. We're here to make sure you're taken care of." Noah's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "I'm already being taken care of." "That may be, but the law is clear." "The law," Silas cut in, his voice like iron, "can go to hell." The deputy's hand shifted on his revolver, and Pritchard raised a hand, his tone sharpening. "Mr. Crow, I strongly advise you not to interfere with the legal proceeding." Silas stepped between Noah and the men, his shoulders squared, his eyes hard as stone. "And I strongly advise you to get off my land." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind hissed through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Then Pritchard folded his papers with deliberate care and tucked them back into his satchel. "Very well," he said, "but understand this, Mr. Crow. This matter is not settled. We will return with the proper authority, and when we do, you will comply, or you will face the consequences." He remounted his horse, and the deputy tipped his hat, his expression unreadable. Then they turned and rode away, leaving Silas and Noah standing alone in the yard, the dust swirling around them like ghosts. Silas didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Noah, his voice low and steady. "You're not going anywhere." Noah looked up at him, his eyes wide, disbelieving. But they said, I don't care what they said. You're staying here. With me. The boy's throat worked, and for the first time since Silas had met him, tears welled in his eyes. But he blinked them back, his voice breaking as he whispered, Why? Silas reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder, his hand firm and sure. Because you're not alone anymore. And I'll be damned if I let anyone take you. Noah nodded, unable to speak, and Silas pulled him into the house, his mind already racing. He didn't know what the law would bring next, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't letting them take the boy. Not without a fight. The house felt smaller that night, like the walls had drawn in closer. Silas sat at the kitchen table long after supper, a cup of cold coffee between his hands, staring at the grain of the wood as if it might hold answers. Across from him, Noah picked at the remains of his meal, his fork scraping against the plate in a rhythm that set Silas's teeth on edge. You should eat, Silas said. I'm not hungry. You need to keep your strength up. Noah set down his fork, his voice quiet but firm. What difference does it make? They're coming back. You heard what he said. Silas looked up, meeting the boy's eyes. There was fear there, buried beneath the surface, but also something harder, acceptance. The kind of acceptance that came from being let down too many times to hope for anything different. They can come back all they want, Silas said. Doesn't mean they're taking you. You can't fight the law. Watch me. Noah shook his head, his mouth twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. You don't understand. This isn't about me. It's about the land my father left. There are people who want it, and they'll use me to get it. That's all I am to them, a way to claim something that isn't theirs. Silas leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. Then we make sure they can't. How? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. The boy stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Doubt, maybe, or the first crack in the wall. But Silas didn't flinch, didn't look away. He'd made a promise, and he meant to keep it. Finally, Noah nodded, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. I'm going to bed. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. Noah stood and headed toward the stairs, but he paused in the doorway, his voice barely audible. Mr. Crow? Yeah? Thank you for not sending me away. Silas's throat tightened, and he had to force the words out. You don't need to thank me, son. This is your home now. The boy's eyes glistened, and he ducked his head, disappearing up the stairs before Silas could say anything else. Silas sat alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing in on him, and wondered what the hell he'd just committed himself to. But even as doubt crept in, he knew he wouldn't change his mind. Not now. Not ever. The next morning, Silas rode into town before dawn, the cold biting at his face as the sky turned from black to gray. He left Noah with strict instructions to stay inside, to keep the rifle close, and not to open the door for anyone. The boy had nodded, his face pale but determined, and Silas had ridden out with the image of those wide, frightened eyes burned into his mind. The town of Bitterroot sat in a shallow valley, a collection of wooden buildings and muddy streets that sprang to life only when the ranchers came in for supplies or the miners rolled through on their way to the hills. Silas tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside, the warmth of the stove hitting him like a wall. Sheriff Tom Garner looked up from his desk, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Silas, didn't expect to see you this early. What brings you in? Silas closed the door behind him and took off his hat, turning it in his hands. I need your help, Tom. The smile faded. Garner leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. What kind of help? The kind that involves keeping a boy from being dragged off by men who have no right to him. Garner's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to the edge of his desk, fingers drumming a slow rhythm. You talking about the Reed boy? Silas's jaw tightened. Word travels fast. It does when the Territorial Land Office sends a wire ahead. Pritchard came through here yesterday, asked me about you. Wanted to know if you were a man of good character or a troublemaker. And what did you tell him? Garner's mouth twitched. I told him you were stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but that you'd never done anything that wasn't square. He didn't seem convinced. Silas set his hat on the desk and leaned forward, his voice low. Tom, that boy's been with me for a month. He's a good kid, works hard, doesn't cause trouble, doesn't ask for anything he hasn't earned. And now these men want to take him away, lock him up in some holding facility while they fight over land his father left behind. I can't let that happen." Garner studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What are you asking me to do, Silas?" "I'm asking you to stand with me. When they come back, and they will come back, I need you to tell them the boy's under your protection, that he's safe where he is. And if they don't listen, then we make them listen." Garner exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "You know what you're asking, don't you? You're asking me to put my neck on the line for a kid I've never met, against men who have the law on their side." "I know." "And you think that's going to end well?" Silas straightened, his eyes hard. "I think it's the right thing to do, and I think you know it too." Garner was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the window, where the first light of morning was spilling across the street. Then he sighed and stood, reaching for his coat. "All right," he said, "but if this goes sideways, you're buying me a drink for the rest of my life." Silas's mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smile. "Deal." They rode back to the ranch together, the sun climbing higher as the frost melted from the grass. Garner didn't say much, just rode alongside Silas with the easy silence of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. When they reached the ranch, Noah was standing on the porch, the rifle cradled in his arms, his face tight with worry. "It's all right," Silas called out as he dismounted. "He's a friend." Noah lowered the rifle but didn't set it down, his eyes flicking between Silas and the sheriff. Garner dismounted and tipped his hat, his expression neutral. "You must be Noah." The boy nodded, his voice cautious. "Yes, sir." "I'm Sheriff Garner. Silas tells me you've been working for him." "Yes, sir." Garner glanced at Silas, then back at Noah. "He also tells me some men came by yesterday, trying to take you away." Noah's grip on the rifle tightened. "They said it was the law." "It might be," Garner said, "but that doesn't make it right. Now, I need you to tell me the truth, son. Do you want to stay here with Silas, or do you want to go with those men?" Noah's eyes widened, and he looked at Silas, then back at the sheriff. "I want to stay." "Why?" The boy's voice cracked, but he didn't look away. "Because this is the first place I've felt safe in a long time. And Mr. Crow, he's the first person who's treated me like I matter." Garner nodded slowly, his expression softening. "All right then. That's all I needed to hear." He turned to Silas, his voice dropping. "You know they're going to push back hard on this. Pritchard's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer." "I know." "And you're prepared for what that means?" Silas met his gaze, unflinching. "I am." Garner clapped him on the shoulder, then swung back into the saddle. "Then I'll do what I can. But you better be ready, Silas. This fight's just getting started." He rode off, leaving Silas and Noah standing in the yard, the wind tugging at their clothes. Noah set the rifle down and looked up at Silas, his voice small. "What happens now?" Silas placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip firm. "Now we wait, and we get ready." The days that followed were quiet, but the tension never left. Silas kept Noah close, working the ranch as usual, but always with one eye on the road. He taught the boy how to shoot, how to handle the rifle with respect and precision, and how to stay calm when fear tried to take over. Noah absorbed it all with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything else, his movements deliberate, his focus absolute. At night, Silas sat on the porch with a loaded shotgun across his knees, listening to the sounds of the land, the cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the pines, the creak of the barn door swinging on its hinges. He didn't sleep much, couldn't afford to. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like the beginning of the end. But the men didn't come. A week passed, then two. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, and Silas began to wonder if maybe they'd given up, if maybe the sheriff's presence had been enough to turn them away. But deep down, he knew better. Men like Pritchard didn't give up. They just changed tactics. It was late afternoon when the wagon rolled up the road, slow and deliberate, the driver hunched forward with the reins loose in his hands. Silas saw it from the pasture and felt his stomach drop. He called out to Noah, who was working near the barn, and the boy came running, his face already pale. Get inside, Silas said. Lock the door. Don't come out unless I tell you to. What if... No arguments. Go. Noah hesitated, then turned and ran for the house. Silas grabbed the shotgun from where he'd left it, leaning against the fence, and walked toward the wagon, his heart pounding in his chest. The driver pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, a tall man with a weathered face and graying hair. He wore a duster that had seen better days, and his boots were caked with mud. But it was his eyes that caught Silas's attention, sharp, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading people and finding their weaknesses. "Mr. Crow?" the man said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Henry Dalton. I'm a land agent, working on behalf of a consortium interested in acquiring certain properties in the Eastern Territories. I believe you have a boy staying with you, Noah Reed." Silas's grip on the shotgun tightened. "What of it?" "I'd like to speak with him. Just a conversation, nothing more." "He's not interested." Dalton's smile widened. "With all due respect, Mr. Crow, I think the boy should be the one to decide that. He already has, and I'm telling you to leave." Dalton's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Irritation, maybe, or the first hint of anger. "I understand you've taken a liking to the boy. That's commendable. But you need to understand the situation. Noah's father left behind land that's worth a considerable amount of money. There are legal claims to settle, debts to pay. The boy is entitled to his inheritance, but only if the proper procedures are followed. And you're here to make sure those procedures benefit you." Dalton's smile vanished. "I'm here to ensure that the boy's interests are protected. By locking him up and taking his land? By ensuring that he's placed with people who understand the value of what he's been given." Silas took a step forward, the shotgun rising just enough to make his point clear. "The boy's not going anywhere. Not with you, not with Pritchard, not with anyone. So you can turn that wagon around and get the hell off my land." Dalton studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his voice dropping to something colder, sharper. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Crow. This isn't just about you and the boy. There are people who have invested a great deal of time and money into securing that land, and they won't take kindly to interference. Then they can come tell me that themselves." Dalton's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He climbed back into the wagon and took up the reins, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. "You'll regret this." "I doubt it." The wagon rolled away, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Silas stood there until it was out of sight, then lowered the shotgun and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Noah stepped out onto the porch, his face drawn. "What did he want?" "Same thing they all want," Silas said, his voice rough. "To use you." Noah's hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring this on you." Silas turned, his expression fierce. "You didn't bring anything on me. This isn't your fault, Noah. None of it is, and I'm not letting them take you. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face, and Silas crossed the yard in 3 long strides, pulling him into a rough embrace. Noah clung to him, his shoulders shaking, and Silas held him tight, his own throat burning with emotions he couldn't name. "You're safe," Silas murmured, his voice breaking. "I promise you, you're safe." That night, Silas sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to put his thoughts into words. He wasn't a man of letters, never had been, but he needed to make his case clear. He needed to find a way to prove that Noah belonged here, that he was safe, that the boy had a right to choose his own future. He wrote until his hand cramped, crossing out lines and starting over, struggling to find the right way to say what he felt. But the words kept slipping away, tangled up in fear and anger, and something deeper that he didn't have a name for. Noah came down the stairs, his footsteps soft on the wood, and sat across from him. "What are you doing?" "Trying to figure out how to fight this." "You can't fight the law, Mr. Crow. Not by yourself." Silas set down the pen, his voice steady. "Then I'll find people who will stand with me." Noah was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table, his hand resting on Silas's arm. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything?" "Owe me?" Silas looked at the boy, really looked at him. at the thin face and the sharp eyes and the quiet strength that had carried him through more than any child should have to endure. And he realized, with a clarity that cut through every doubt, that this wasn't about obligation. It wasn't about debt or duty or doing the right thing because the world expected it. It was about something simpler and infinitely more complicated. Because you're mine, Silas said, his voice rough. Maybe not by blood, maybe not by law, but by everything that matters. And I protect what's mine. Noah's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak. Silas reached across the table and gripped his hand, holding on like he could anchor the boy to this place, to this moment, to the fragile promise of a future they were both too afraid to believe in. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out to the night. But inside the house, in the warm glow of the lamp, two people sat together in silence, bound by something stronger than words. And for the first time in a long time, Silas believed they might actually stand a chance. The answer came 3 days later, delivered by a rider who didn't dismount, just handed Silas an envelope and rode off without a word. Silas tore it open, his hand shaking, and read the contents twice before the meaning sank in. It was a summons, a court hearing scheduled for 2 weeks from now to determine Noah's legal guardianship and the disposition of his father's estate. Pritchard's name was at the bottom, along with a note in cramped handwriting. "We trust you will comply with the court's authority, Mr. Crow. Failure to do so will result in immediate legal action." Silas crumpled the paper in his fist, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Noah was standing in the doorway, his face pale. "What does it say?" Silas smoothed out the paper and handed it to him. Noah read it slowly, his lips moving as he worked through the words, and when he looked up, his eyes were filled with resignation. "They're going to take me, aren't they?" "Not if I have anything to say about it." "But the court doesn't know you," Silas said, his voice hard. "They don't know what you've been through, what you've survived, and they sure as hell don't know what it means to have a home, but I'm going to make damn sure they understand before they try to tear this apart." Noah's throat worked, and he set the paper down on the table, his voice breaking. "What if it's not enough?" Silas stepped forward and gripped the boy's shoulders, his eyes burning with intensity. "Then we'll find another way. But I'm not giving up on you, Noah. Not now, not ever. Do you hear me?" The boy nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks, and Silas pulled him close, holding him like he could shield him from the world. And as they stood there in the fading light, the shadows growing long around them, Silas made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whoever he had to face, he would keep this boy safe, even if it cost him everything. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed like water through cupped hands, too fast to hold, too precious to waste. Silas threw himself into preparation with the same relentless focus he'd once used to build the ranch from nothing. He rode into town 3 times, meeting with Sheriff Garner, with the local minister, with anyone who might be willing to stand as a character witness. He wrote letters to neighboring ranchers, asking them to attest to Noah's character and the stability of the home he'd provided. Some agreed. Others didn't respond at all. Noah worked beside him through it all, quieter than usual, his movements mechanical. He mucked stalls and mended fences and hauled water with the same precision as always, but the light had gone out of his eyes. At night, Silas would hear him moving in the loft, restless and sleepless. And more than once he found the boy sitting on the porch steps in the cold darkness, staring at nothing. "Can't sleep?" Silas asked one night, stepping out with a blanket draped over his arm. Noah shook his head, his breath misting in the frigid air. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them taking me away." Silas sat down beside him and draped the blanket over the boy's shoulders. "That's not going to happen." "You don't know that." "I know I'm not going to let it happen without a fight." Noah pulled the blanket tighter, his voice barely a whisper. "What if fighting isn't enough?" Silas didn't have an answer for that, so he just sat there in the cold, shoulder to shoulder with the boy, and let the silence speak for him. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and bitter, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Silas woke before dawn and found Noah already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded in his lap. The boy had put on his cleanest shirt, the one Silas had bought him in town 2 weeks ago, and he'd combed his hair back with water until it lay flat against his skull. He looked small in the oversized chair, fragile in a way that made Silas's chest tighten. You ready? Silas asked, pouring coffee he knew neither of them would drink. No, Noah said honestly, but I don't think I'll ever be. They ate a silent breakfast, the food tasteless and heavy, and then Silas hitched the wagon and they rode into town together. The streets of Bitterroot were quiet, most folks still inside against the cold, but Silas could feel eyes watching from behind curtains and half-open doors. Word had spread. Everyone knew why they were here. The courthouse was a squat brick building at the end of Main Street, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Silas tied off the wagon and helped Noah down, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. Whatever happens in there, Silas said, his voice low, you tell the truth. You hear me? Don't lie to make things easier. Don't tell them what you think they want to hear, just the truth. Noah nodded, his face pale. What if the truth isn't enough? Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But you're not alone in this, son. Remember that. They walked up the courthouse steps together, and Silas pushed open the heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was stuffy and warm, heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner. Rows of wooden benches lined the room, most of them empty except for a handful of spectators scattered throughout. At the front, behind a raised desk, sat Judge Matthias Keller, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes like flint. To the left sat Samuel Pritchard, looking crisp and confident in a dark suit. Beside him was Henry Dalton, the land agent, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Sheriff Garner was already there, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed. He caught Silas's eye and gave a slight nod. Reverend Thomas, the town minister, sat in the front row, his weathered Bible resting on his knee. 3 ranchers Silas had reached out to were scattered among the benches, their faces grave. Silas guided Noah to the front bench and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The boy's hands were shaking, and Silas reached over and gripped one of them, squeezing hard. Breathe, Silas murmured. Just breathe. Judge Keller rapped his gavel, the sound sharp and final. This court is now in session. We are here to determine the matter of guardianship and estate disposition regarding the minor child, Noah Reed. Mr. Pritchard, you may present your case. Pritchard stood, smoothing his jacket, and addressed the judge with the practiced ease of a man who'd done this 100 times before. Your Honor, the matter before us is straightforward. Noah Reed is the sole surviving heir to a considerable land holding in the Eastern Territories, left to him by his late father, Marcus Reed. However, the boy is currently residing with Mr. Silas Crow, a rancher with no legal claim to guardianship and no familial relationship to the child. The Territorial Land Office has determined that the boy must be placed in protective custody until his legal status and the disposition of his father's estate can be properly resolved. And where would this protective custody take place? The judge asked. A facility in Helena, Your Honor, designed to house minors in legal limbo. The boy would be well cared for while the court settled the estate matters. And how long might that take? Pritchard's expression didn't change. It's difficult to say, Your Honor. These matters can be complex. 6 months, perhaps a year. A murmur ran through the room. Silas felt Noah's hand clench in his, and he squeezed back, his jaw tight. Judge Keller glanced down at the papers in front of him. And what is the nature of this estate? Why is it necessary to remove the boy from his current situation? Pritchard hesitated just for a moment, and Dalton leaned forward, whispering something in his ear. Pritchard nodded and continued. The land in question is valuable, Your Honor. It contains water rights and mineral deposits that make it desirable to several interested parties. There are competing claims, debts left unpaid, legal entanglements that require careful navigation. The boy cannot be expected to manage such matters on his own, and Mr. Crow lacks the legal authority to act on his behalf. I see, the judge said. And who would manage these matters in the boy's absence? The Territorial Land Office would oversee the process, Your Honor, ensuring that the boy's interests are protected. Silas stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. That's a lie. The judge's eyes snapped to him. Mr. Crow, you will sit down and wait your turn to speak, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Silas didn't move. With respect, Your Honor, I won't sit quietly while this man twists the truth. This isn't about protecting Noah's interests. It's about taking his land. Pritchard's expression hardened. Your Honor, Mr. Crow is out of line. Mr. Crow, the judge said, his voice sharp. Sit down, now. Silas held the judge's gaze for a long moment, then slowly lowered himself back onto the bench. Noah was staring at him with wide eyes, and Silas gave him a tight nod. Judge Keller turned back to Pritchard. Continue. Pritchard cleared his throat, his composure returning. As I was saying, Your Honor, the boy requires supervision and legal representation that Mr. Crow cannot provide. The land office is prepared to ensure that Noah's inheritance is preserved and that he receives proper care during the transition. And what happens to the land while the boy is in custody? Pritchard's pause was almost imperceptible. It would be held in trust, Your Honor, until the legal matters are resolved. Held in trust by whom? By the consortium that Mr. Dalton represents, Your Honor. They have offered to manage the property responsibly, ensuring that it remains productive and that any profits are held for the boy's benefit. Silas's hands curled into fists. The judge studied Pritchard for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. Mr. Crow, you may present your case. Silas stood again, his heart pounding. He wasn't a man of speeches, never had been, but he forced himself to meet the judge's eyes and speak from the gut. Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know all the fancy words these men use, but I know what's right, and taking Noah away from the only home he's had in years, isn't it? That boy's been with me for 2 months now. He works harder than most grown men I know. He's respectful, honest, and he's never once asked for more than he's earned. He's not a piece of property to be managed or a problem to be solved. He's a child who deserves a stable home, and I'm prepared to give him that. And what makes you qualified to be his guardian, Mr. Crow? The judge asked. Silas swallowed hard. I've got a ranch that's been running for 15 years. I've got land, livestock, and enough income to provide for him. I've got no debts, no legal troubles, and a reputation in this town that anyone here can speak to. But more than that, Your Honor, I've got something these men don't. I care about what happens to Noah. Not his land, not his inheritance. Him. The judge's expression didn't change. And what does the boy want? Silas glanced down at Noah, who was sitting rigid on the bench, his face pale. I think you should ask him yourself, Your Honor. Judge Keller nodded. Noah Reed, please stand. Noah stood slowly, his legs shaking. The judge's voice softened, just a fraction. Son, I know this is difficult, but I need you to answer me honestly. Do you want to stay with Mr. Crow, or do you want to go with the men from the land office? Noah's throat worked, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. I want to stay with Mr. Crow. Why? The boy's hands clenched at his sides, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. Because he's the first person who's ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere. He doesn't care about my father's land. He just cares about me, and His voice broke, and tears spilled down his cheeks. I don't want to lose that. The room was silent. Even Pritchard seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Judge Keller studied Noah for a long moment, then nodded. You may sit down, son. Noah collapsed onto the bench, and Silas gripped his shoulder, holding him steady. The judge turned to the spectators. I'd like to hear from anyone else who has knowledge of this situation. Sheriff Garner? Garner stepped forward, his voice calm and measured. Your Honor, I've known Silas Crow for over a decade. He's a good man, honest and hardworking. He's never been in trouble with the law, never caused problems in this town. And I've seen the way he treats that boy, like he's his own. If you're asking me whether Noah would be safe with him, the answer is yes. The judge nodded. Reverend Thomas? The Reverend stood, his voice gentle. Your Honor, I've spoken with both Mr. Crow and young Noah. What I've seen is a man doing his best to provide a stable, caring home for a child who desperately needs one. I believe the boy's welfare is best served by allowing him to remain where he is. One by one, the ranchers spoke, each offering similar testimony. By the time they'd finished, Pritchard's confidence had begun to crack. He stood again, his voice sharp. Your Honor, these testimonials are all well and good, but they don't address the central issue, the boy's inheritance. Mr. Crow has no legal authority to manage the estate, and without proper oversight, the land could be lost, squandered, or stolen. The boy deserves better than that. And you believe locking him in a facility in Helena is better? The judge asked, his tone dry. Pritchard's jaw tightened. I believe the boy deserves professional management of his assets, Your Honor. Mr. Crow, with all due respect, is a rancher, not a lawyer or a land manager. He cannot protect the boy's interests. Silas stood again, his voice rising. I can protect the boy, Your Honor. That's more than these men can say. Mr. Crow, they don't care about Noah, Silas said, his voice shaking with anger. They care about his land, and if you send him with them, you're handing him over to people who see him as nothing more than a key to a locked door. Is that what you want? Is that justice? Judge Keller's eyes flashed, but his voice remained calm. Mr. Crow, I will not tolerate outbursts in my courtroom. Sit down. Silas sat, his chest heaving. The judge turned back to Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, I have a question for you. If this is truly about the boy's welfare, why has the land office not attempted to place him with a family? Why a holding facility? Pritchard hesitated. The situation is complicated, Your Honor. Answer the question. Pritchard's composure cracked. Because the land is valuable, Your Honor, and the boy's placement must be handled carefully to ensure that all legal claims are properly adjudicated. In other words, the judge said, his voice cold, you want the boy out of the way so you can fight over his inheritance without interference. Pritchard's face flushed. That's exactly what this is, the judge said, and I'll be damned if I let it happen in my courtroom. He rapped his gavel, the sound echoing through the room. Here is my ruling. Noah Reed will remain in the custody of Silas Crow, pending the appointment of a legal guardian. Mr. Crow, you will petition the court within 30 days to formalize your guardianship. In the meantime, the boy's inheritance will be placed in a trust overseen by this court, not by the Territorial Land Office, and certainly not by Mr. Dalton's consortium. The land will remain untouched until Noah comes of age, or until a legal guardian is appointed to manage it on his behalf. Is that clear? Pritchard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Dalton stood abruptly, his face dark with anger, but the judge's glare stopped him cold. Is that clear, Mr. Pritchard? Pritchard's voice was tight. Yes, Your Honor. Good. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell again, and the room erupted in murmurs. Silas sat frozen, the judge's words ringing in his ears. Noah turned to him, his eyes wide and disbelieving. Does that mean... It means you're staying, Silas said, his voice rough. You're staying with me. Noah's face crumpled, and he threw his arms around Silas, sobbing into his chest. Silas held him tight, his own eyes burning, and for the first time in weeks he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd won. They left the courthouse together, stepping out into the cold afternoon air. Snow had begun to fall, light and soft, dusting the streets and rooftops. Sheriff Garner was waiting by the wagon, a faint smile on his face. Well, he said, that went better than I expected. Silas shook his hand, his grip firm. Thank you, Tom. For everything. Garner shrugged. Just doing what's right. But you heard the judge. You've got 30 days to file that petition. Don't waste them. I won't. Noah climbed into the wagon, still trembling, and Silas followed, taking up the reins. As they rolled out of town, the boy leaned against his side, and Silas draped an arm around his shoulders, holding him close. Mr. Crow? Noah said quietly. Yeah? What do I call you now? Silas's throat tightened, and he had to force the words out. What do you want to call me? Noah was silent for a long moment, then looked up at him, his eyes shining. Can I call you Pa? Silas's vision blurred, and he pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face the boy fully. You can call me whatever feels right, son, but if you're asking if I'd be honored to be your pa, the answer is yes. Noah's face broke into the first real smile Silas had seen from him, and he nodded, wiping at his eyes. Then I'll call you Pa. Silas pulled him into a fierce embrace, his own tears falling freely now. Then that's what you'll call me. From now on, that's what you'll call me. They sat there in the falling snow, holding on to each other like they were the only two people in the world. And in that moment, Silas knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever battles they still had to fight, they'd face them together. Because they were family now, and nothing, not the law, not men like Pritchard and Dalton, not the whole damn world, was going to take that away. They drove home through the snow in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy, fearful quiet of the weeks before, but something lighter, almost peaceful. Noah sat close to Silas, his shoulder pressed against the older man's side, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The judge's words had done that for them. When they reached the ranch, the sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange behind the gray clouds. Silas unhitched the wagon while Noah fed the horses, and they moved through the evening chores with the easy rhythm they'd developed over the past 2 months. But there was something different in the air now, something that felt like possibility. After supper, they sat together at the kitchen table, the warmth of the stove filling the room. Silas had pulled out the papers the judge had given him, the petition for guardianship, a stack of forms that needed to be filled out, signed, and filed within 30 days. He spread them across the table and stared at them, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. Noah leaned over, scanning the first page. "What does it say?" Silas read aloud, stumbling over the legal language. "Petition for permanent guardianship of a minor child. The petitioner must demonstrate financial stability, moral character, and the ability to provide a safe and nurturing environment." He looked up. "I think we can manage that." "What else?" "References. We need letters from people who can vouch for me. The judge said we already have some of those from the hearing, but we'll need more. And we need to prove that I can support you financially." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "That part shouldn't be hard. The ranch brings in enough." Noah was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table and touched the edge of one of the forms. "What about my father's land? The judge said it would be in a trust." "That's right. It'll stay there until you're old enough to decide what to do with it. Nobody can touch it without the court's permission." Silas met the boy's eyes. "Does that bother you? Knowing it's out there but you can't do anything with it?" Noah shook his head slowly. "I don't care about the land. I never did. My father—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "He cared more about that land than he ever cared about me. It can sit there and rot for all I care." Silas heard the bitterness in the boy's voice, the old wounds that hadn't healed. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "I know." Noah was silent for a moment, staring at his hands. Then he spoke again, his voice quiet. "My father wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't a good one either. After my mother died, he just disappeared into himself. He spent all his time trying to build something, trying to make something out of nothing, and when he finally did, when he got that land, it was all he thought about. I was just in the way." "You weren't in the way, Noah. I was to him." The boy's voice cracked. "When he died, I thought maybe I'd feel something, relief or sadness or I don't know, but I didn't feel anything at all. And then those men showed up telling me I was valuable because of what he left behind, and I realized that's all I'd ever been to anyone, just a way to get to something else." Silas reached across the table and gripped the boy's hand. "That's not all you are. Not to me." Noah looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know, that's why I want to stay." They sat there for a long moment, the silence wrapping around them like a blanket. Then Silas squeezed the boy's hand and let go, turning back to the papers. "All right," he said. "Let's get this done." The next morning, Silas rode into town alone, leaving Noah with instructions to keep the rifle close and not to open the door for anyone. The boy had nodded, his face serious, and Silas had left with a knot of worry in his chest that didn't ease until he was halfway to Bitterroot. He needed to file the petition, but more than that, he needed to understand what he was up against. Judge Keller had made his ruling, but Pritchard and Dalton weren't the kind of men who gave up easily. They'd find another angle, another way to come after Noah's land, and Silas needed to be ready. He found Sheriff Garner in his office, nursing a cup of coffee and reading a week-old newspaper. The sheriff looked up when Silas walked in and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Figured I'd see you today," Garner said. "You here to file the petition?" "That's part of it." Silas sat down, his hat in his hands. "But I need to know what I'm dealing with, Tom. Those men aren't going to let this go. What's their next move?" Garner set down his coffee and leaned back in his chair. "Hard to say. The judge's ruling was pretty clear and they'd be stupid to try to go around it. But men like Pritchard and Dalton don't get where they are by playing fair. My guess? They'll look for a technicality, something in your background or your finances that they can use to challenge the guardianship. There's nothing to find. I've got no debts, no criminal record, nothing. That you know of. Garner's expression was grave. These men have resources, Silas. They can dig up things you didn't even know existed. A disputed land claim from years ago, a business deal that went sour, anything they can twist to make you look unfit. Silas's jaw tightened. So what do I do? You get ahead of it. Make sure your affairs are in order. Talk to a lawyer, get your financials documented, and make damn sure there's nothing in your past that can come back to bite you. Garner paused. And you watch your back. Men like Dalton don't like losing, and they've got deep pockets. If they can't beat you in court, they might try other methods. Like what? Like making your life difficult, pressuring your neighbors, spreading rumors, maybe even sabotaging your ranch. I'm not saying they will, but I've seen it happen before. Silas felt a cold knot of anger settle in his chest. Let them try. Garner shook his head. Don't be reckless, Silas. You've got a boy depending on you now. You can't afford to let your temper get the better of you. I know. Silas stood, his voice steady. But I'm not backing down, Tom. Not for them. Not for anyone. Garner stood as well and extended his hand. I didn't expect you would. Just be smart about it. Silas shook his hand and left the office, his mind racing. He spent the rest of the morning at the courthouse, filing the petition and gathering copies of the documents he'd need. By the time he headed back to the ranch, the sun was high overhead, and the knot of worry in his chest had loosened just a little. The days that followed were busy. Silas threw himself into the work of preparing for the guardianship hearing, gathering letters of reference, documenting his finances, and meeting with a lawyer in the next town over. The lawyer, a shrewd man named Benjamin Hartwell, reviewed Silas's case and assured him that everything looked solid. You've got a strong position, Hartwell said, leaning back in his chair. The judge's ruling was clear, and you've got plenty of support from the community. As long as there are no surprises, this should go through without a hitch. And if there are surprises? Hartwell's expression didn't change. Then we deal with them. But I wouldn't worry too much, Mr. Crow. You're doing everything right. Silas left the lawyer's office feeling cautiously optimistic, but the unease never fully went away. He couldn't shake the feeling that Pritchard and Dalton were out there somewhere, plotting their next move. Back at the ranch, Noah had settled into a new routine. He worked the land with the same quiet determination as always, but there was a lightness to him now, a sense of ease that hadn't been there before. He smiled more, talked more, and even laughed once or twice at something Silas said. It was a small thing, but it filled Silas with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Noah broke the silence. Pa? Silas glanced over, still getting used to the sound of that word. Yeah? What happens after the guardianship goes through? Will things be different? Different how? Noah shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't know. Will I still work the ranch? Will I go to school? What happens to me? Silas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. That's up to you, son. If you want to keep working the ranch, you're welcome to. If you want to go to school, we'll figure out a way to make that happen. This is your home now, and you get to decide what your life looks like. Noah looked at him, his eyes wide. Really? Really? The boy's throat worked, and he nodded slowly. I think I'd like to stay here. Work the ranch. Learn how to run it, maybe, if that's all right. Silas felt his chest tighten, and he reached over, gripping the boy's shoulder. More than all right. I'd be honored to teach you. Noah smiled, and they sat together in the fading light, the bond between them growing stronger with every passing moment. The first sign of trouble came 2 weeks later. Silas was in the barn, repairing a broken harness, when he heard the sound of hooves on the road. He stepped outside and saw a lone rider approaching, a man he didn't recognize. The rider pulled up in front of the house and dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. Mr. Crow? The man called out. Silas walked toward him, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. That's me. What can I do for you? The man was middle-aged with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He wore a dusty coat and carried a leather satchel over his shoulder. Name's William Taggart. I'm an investigator. hired by the Territorial Land Office to look into your petition for guardianship. Silas's jaw tightened. The judge already made his ruling. I'm aware, but the Land Office has the right to conduct its own investigation, to ensure that the boy's interests are being properly protected. Taggart's tone was neutral, but there was something calculating in his eyes. I need to ask you a few questions, Mr. Crow. Won't take long. Silas crossed his arms. Ask. Taggart pulled a notebook from his satchel and flipped it open. How long have you owned this ranch? 15 years? And how did you acquire it? Bought it from the previous owner, paid in full. Taggart made a note. Do you have the deed? I do. And your finances, are you able to support the boy adequately? Silas's voice was hard. I've been supporting him for 2 months. He's fed, clothed, and has a roof over his head. That's more than most kids have. Taggart's expression didn't change. I'm sure it is, but the Land Office needs to verify that you have the means to continue providing for him long term. Can you provide documentation of your income and expenses? I already gave all that to my lawyer. I'll need to see it as well. Silas's hands curled into fists, but he kept his voice level. Fine, I'll get it for you. He turned and walked into the house, his mind racing. This was exactly what Garner had warned him about. Pritchard and Dalton weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics. He grabbed the folder of documents from the desk and brought it back outside, thrusting it into Taggart's hands. Here, everything you need is in there. Taggart took the folder and began flipping through it, his eyes scanning the pages. This looks in order, but I'll need to verify the information independently. I'll be back in a few days. You do that. Taggart mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Silas standing in the yard with a sinking feeling in his gut. He turned and saw Noah watching from the barn doorway, his face pale. Who was that? The boy asked. Nobody important, Silas said, but the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Taggart returned 3 days later, and this time he wasn't alone. He brought a clerk from the land office, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who carried an armful of ledgers and documents. They spent hours going through Silas's finances, asking questions, taking notes, and scrutinizing every detail. By the time they left, Silas felt like he'd been put through a wringer. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, exhausted and frustrated. Noah sat across from him, his expression worried. What are they looking for? The boy asked. Anything they can use against me, Silas said. Anything that makes me look unfit to be your guardian. But you're not unfit. You've been nothing but good to me. I know, son, but they don't care about that. They care about getting your land, and if they can prove I'm not capable of taking care of you, they can take you away and go after it. Noah's face paled. They can't do that. The judge made a ruling, but these men are looking for a way around it, and if they find one, they'll use it. Noah was silent for a long moment, then stood and walked around the table. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, his voice steady. Then we won't let them find one. Silas looked up at the boy, at the determination in his eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about protecting Noah anymore. It was about proving to the world and to himself that he was worthy of the trust this boy had placed in him. You're right, Silas said, his voice firm. We won't. The investigation dragged on for another week, and with each passing day, Silas felt the pressure mounting. Taggart and his clerk returned multiple times, each visit more invasive than the last. They questioned the neighbors, talked to the ranchers who'd spoken at the hearing, and even interviewed Sheriff Garner. Silas could see the doubt creeping into people's eyes, the whispers starting to spread. What if the land office was right? What if Silas wasn't the right person to raise the boy? But through it all, Noah stood by him, quiet and steady. The boy worked the ranch without complaint, helped with the chores, and never once asked if they were going to lose. He believed in Silas, and that belief was like an anchor, holding Silas steady when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Taggart returned one last time. Silas met him in the yard, his jaw set. Well, Silas asked, did you find what you were looking for? Taggart's expression was unreadable. I've completed my investigation, Mr. Crow. My report will be submitted to the land office and the court within the next few days. And? Taggart hesitated, then met Silas's eyes. For what it's worth, I couldn't find anything that would disqualify you as a guardian. Your finances are solid, your property is well maintained, and everyone I spoke to vouched for your character. If I were making the decision, I'd approve the petition. Silas felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he kept his expression neutral. But you're not making the decision. No, I'm not. That's up to the court. But I'll be recommending approval in my report. Why are you telling me this? Taggart shrugged. Because I think you deserve to know. And because I've seen enough cases like this to know when someone's being railroaded. Those men from the land office don't care about the boy. They care about the land. But you... He paused. You care about him. That's worth something. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Silas standing in the yard with a knot of hope blooming in his chest. When he turned, he saw Noah watching from the porch, his face cautiously optimistic. What did he say? Noah asked. Silas walked over and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. He said we're going to be fine. Noah's eyes widened and a smile broke across his face. Really? Really? The boy threw his arms around Silas and Silas held him tight, his own eyes burning. They weren't out of the woods yet. The court still had to make its final decision. But for the first time in weeks, Silas allowed himself to believe that they might actually win. The final hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and Silas spent the time preparing as best he could. He met with his lawyer, reviewed the documents one last time, and made sure everything was in order. But more than that, he spent time with Noah, teaching him how to run the ranch, how to handle the cattle, how to mend fences and fix equipment. The boy absorbed it all with the same quiet focus he brought to everything, and Silas felt a swell of pride every time he watched him work. On the morning of the hearing, they rode into town together, the air crisp and clear. The courthouse was more crowded this time, filled with townspeople who'd come to see the outcome. Silas spotted Pritchard and Dalton sitting in the front row, their expressions tight, and he felt a flicker of satisfaction. They knew they were losing. Judge Keller entered, and the room fell silent. He took a seat behind the bench and shuffled through the papers in front of him, his expression grave. This court is reconvened to finalize the matter of guardianship for Noah Reed, he said. I've reviewed the investigator's report, as well as the petition filed by Mr. Crow. I've also considered the objections raised by the Territorial Land Office. Silas's heart pounded in his chest. Noah sat beside him, his hands clenched in his lap. After careful consideration, the judge continued, I find that Mr. Silas Crow meets all the requirements for legal guardianship. He has demonstrated financial stability, moral character, and the ability to provide a safe and nurturing environment for the boy. Therefore, I am granting the petition. Effective immediately, Silas Crow is the legal guardian of Noah Reed. The gavel fell, and the room erupted. Silas sat frozen, the judge's words echoing in his ears. Noah turned to him, his face radiant with joy, and threw his arms around him. We did it, the boy whispered. We did it, Pa. Silas held him tight, his throat too tight to speak. Around them, people were clapping, shaking hands, offering congratulations. But all Silas could focus on was the boy in his arms, the child who'd walked into his life 2 months ago and changed everything. They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright afternoon sun, and Silas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. This was it. This was their new beginning, and nothing, not Pritchard, not Dalton, not anyone, could take it away. The ride home felt different this time. The skies stretched wide and blue above them, unmarred by clouds, and the winter sun cast long shadows across the road. Noah sat beside Silas in the wagon, still trembling slightly, a smile he couldn't quite suppress, tugging at the corners of his mouth. Every few minutes he'd glance over at Silas as if to confirm this was real, that it wasn't some dream he'd wake from to find himself alone again. Silas understood the feeling. He kept one hand on the reins and the other resting on the seat between them, close enough that Noah could reach for it if he needed to. They didn't talk much. There was too much to say and no words big enough to hold it all. But the silence was comfortable now, warm even, like coming in from the cold to find a fire already burning. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Noah let out a breath that sounded like relief and wonder mixed together. "It looks different," he said quietly. "It's the same as it was this morning," Silas said. "I know, but it feels different." Noah paused, searching for the words. "It feels like home." Silas's throat tightened, and he had to clear it before he could speak. "That's because it is." They unhitched the wagon together, moving through the familiar routine with practiced ease. Noah fed the horses while Silas checked the fence line near the barn. The cattle were settled in the south pasture, the chickens were pecking in the yard, and everything was exactly as they'd left it. Ordinary. Simple. Perfect. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with a simple supper between them. Beans, cornbread, bacon Silas had fried up crispy the way Noah liked it. The boy ate slowly, savoring each bite, and when he finished, he pushed his plate away and looked across the table at Silas with an expression that was part gratitude, part uncertainty. "What happens now?" Noah asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the court said you're my guardian. The land office can't take me away. But what about them? Pritchard and Dalton, they're not just going to give up, are they?" Silas had been wondering the same thing. He'd seen the look on Dalton's face when the judge made his ruling, the cold fury barely contained beneath that smooth exterior. Men like that didn't walk away from money, especially not the kind of money Noah's inheritance represented. But Silas had also seen something else, a calculation, a reassessment. They'd lost this battle and they knew it. "I don't think they'll try again," Silas said carefully. "Not through the courts, anyway. The judge made it clear where he stands, and they'd be fools to challenge him directly. But they might try something else. Maybe, but we'll be ready if they do." Noah nodded slowly, then looked down at his hands. "I don't want you to have to keep fighting because of me." Silas reached across the table and gripped the boy's wrist, firm but gentle. "Listen to me, son. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't choose to have a father who left you land that other men wanted. You didn't bring this trouble to my door. I chose to keep you here. I chose to fight for you, and I'd do it again 100 times over without a second thought. You understand?" Noah's eyes glistened, and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now finish your supper. We've got early chores tomorrow." The boy smiled and picked up his fork again, and Silas leaned back in his chair, watching him eat and feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless for longer than he cared to remember. Spring came early that year, arriving in a rush of green grass and wildflowers that carpeted the hills in brilliant yellow and purple. The snow melted from the high country, swelling the creeks and filling the air with the sound of running water. Silas and Noah worked side by side from dawn to dusk, repairing winter damage, moving the cattle to fresh pasture, and preparing for the season ahead. Noah had grown in the months since he'd first appeared in the barn doorway. Not just physically, though he had filled out some, his frame less gaunt, his shoulders broader, but in confidence. He moved through the work with purpose now, asking questions when he needed to, but increasingly trusting his own judgment. Silas caught himself more than once simply watching the boy work, marveling at the transformation. One morning in late April, they were mending fence in the east pasture when a rider appeared on the road. Silas straightened, shading his eyes against the sun, and felt a familiar tension creep into his shoulders. But as the rider drew closer, he recognized the broad-shouldered frame and easy posture of Sheriff Garner. "Morning, Tom," Silas called out as the sheriff dismounted. "Morning." Garner tied his horse to a post and walked over, his expression serious. "Got some news I thought you should hear." Noah had stopped working and was watching them, his face wary. Silas set down his hammer and crossed his arms. "What kind of news?" "Henry Dalton left town 3 days ago. Word is he headed back east, probably to report to whoever's bankrolling this whole operation. But before he left, he made some inquiries around town, asking about your ranch, your finances, your reputation." Silas's jaw tightened. "Looking for ammunition?" "That's what I figured, but here's the thing, he didn't find any. Near as I can tell, he came up empty. And yesterday I got word from the Territorial Land Office that they're dropping their objection to the guardianship. Officially, they're citing the judge's ruling and the investigator's report. Unofficially, I think they realized they were wasting their time." Silas felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but he didn't let his guard down. "You think they're really done?" Garner shrugged. "Hard to say for certain, But my gut tells me yes. The court made its ruling, the investigation cleared you, and they've got no legal ground to stand on. They could try to come after Noah when he turns 18, try to convince him to sell the land, but that's years away. For now, I think you're in the clear." Noah had walked over during this exchange, and now he spoke up, his voice steady. "What about the land? What happens to it?" "It stays in trust until you're of age," Garner said. "The court will oversee it, make sure the taxes are paid and the property's maintained. But nobody can touch it without your permission or your guardians until you're old enough to make your own decisions." The boy nodded, then looked at Silas. "Do you think I should sell it? Eventually, I mean?" Silas considered the question carefully. "That's your choice to make, son. It's your inheritance. But if you want my opinion, I'd say hold on to it until you're old enough to know what you really want. Land like that doesn't come along often, and once it's gone for good." "But I don't need it," Noah said. "I've got everything I need right here." The simple honesty of those words hit Silas like a fist to the chest, and he had to look away for a moment to compose himself. When he looked back, Noah was watching him with that same steady gaze he'd had the first day they'd met, the one that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. "Then we'll figure it out when the time comes," Silas said. "For now, let's just focus on what we've got here." Garner clapped Silas on the shoulder. "Sounds like good advice. I'll leave you two to it. Just wanted to let you know things seem to be settling down." After the sheriff rode off, Silas and Noah returned to their work, the rhythmic clang of hammer on wire filling the quiet morning air. But something had shifted. The shadow that had hung over them for months was finally lifting, and in its place was something Silas had almost forgotten how to recognize: peace. Summer came in hot and dry, the kind of heat that shimmered off the earth and made even the horses lazy. Silas taught Noah how to handle the branding iron, how to read the sky for signs of weather, how to gentle a green-broke colt without breaking its spirit. The boy absorbed it all with that same quiet intensity, and more than once Silas found himself thinking that Noah had a real gift for this work, a natural understanding of the land and the animals that couldn't be taught. They fell into an easy rhythm, the kind that comes from spending every day together and learning each other's habits and moods. Silas knew when Noah was working through something in his head because he'd get quiet and focus on whatever task was at hand with extra intensity. Noah knew when Silas's old injuries were bothering him because he'd move a little slower, favor his left side, and grumble about the weather. One evening in late July, they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and red. Noah had been carving again, working on a new piece, a hawk this time, wings spread in flight. The shavings fell in gentle curls at his feet, and the steady scrape of the knife against wood was the only sound besides the wind in the pines. "Pa?" Noah said without looking up from his work. "Yeah? Do you ever think about her, your daughter?" Silas went still. He hadn't talked about Sarah in years, hadn't spoken her name aloud to another living soul since the day he'd buried her beside her mother. But somehow, coming from Noah, the question didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like an invitation. "Every day," Silas said quietly. Noah glanced up, his hands stilling. "What was she like?" Silas was silent for a long moment, searching for the right words. "She was bright, curious. She'd ask 1,000 questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, where the stars went during the day, why horses had 4 legs instead of 6. Drove her mother half crazy sometimes." He smiled despite himself. "She loved animals, had a way with them, just like you do. Could calm a spooked horse just by talking to it." "How old was she?" 7. Just turned 7 the month before the fever took her. Noah's expression softened with understanding. "That's why you didn't want me to stay at first. I reminded you of what you lost." Silas looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw not just the child who'd appeared in his barn 6 months ago, but the young man he was becoming. "Maybe at first, but not anymore." "What changed?" "You're not a replacement for her, Noah. You never could be. But you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to keep going. A reason to build instead of just survive." Noah's eyes filled with tears, and he set down his carving, his voice thick. "You gave me that too." They sat together in the fading light, and Silas felt something settle in his soul that had been broken for 8 long years. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing. There was room now for something else, something that felt like hope. By autumn, the ranch had taken on a different character. Noah had claimed a corner of the barn as his own workshop, filling it with wood and tools and half-finished carvings. He'd made a set of candlesticks for the kitchen table, a new handle for Silas's favorite knife, and a small horse that he'd given to Silas one evening without explanation. Silas kept it on the mantel, where he could see it every time he walked into the room. The neighboring ranchers had started coming around more often, some to trade work or borrow equipment, others just to check in. They'd heard about the court case, about the boy Silas had taken in, and they wanted to see for themselves how things were going. Most left satisfied, nodding their approval at the way Noah handled himself, at the way he and Silas moved together like they'd been working side by side for years instead of months. One afternoon in October, a wagon rolled up the road carrying an unexpected visitor. Silas was in the barn when he heard it, and he walked out to find a tall, thin man climbing down from the driver's seat. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his hair graying at the temples, and he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone used to dealing with important matters. "Mr. Crow?" the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I'm Noah's uncle, his father's brother." Silas felt his entire body go tense. He didn't shake the offered hand. "What do you want?" Reed lowered his hand, his expression pained. "I know how this must look, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I only just learned about my nephew's situation, about the court case and everything that happened. I came to see him, to make sure he's all right." "He's fine." "I'd like to see that for myself, if you don't mind." Silas crossed his arms. "I mind plenty. You're 6 months late. Where were you when those vultures from the land office were trying to take him? Where were you when he was sleeping in barns and going hungry? You show up now, after everything's settled, and expect me to just hand him over?" "I'm not asking you to hand him over," Reed said, his voice steady. "I'm asking for a chance to talk to him, to explain why I wasn't there before." Before Silas could respond, Noah's voice cut through the tension. "Let him stay." Silas turned. The boy was standing in the barn doorway, his face pale but composed. He walked over to stand beside Silas, his eyes fixed on the stranger who claimed to be family. "You're my uncle?" Noah asked. Reed nodded. "I am. I know you don't remember me. You were just a baby the last time I saw you. Your father and I had a falling out years ago. We stopped speaking, stopped being part of each other's lives. I didn't even know he'd passed until 2 months ago, when a lawyer tracked me down about the estate." "Why didn't you come sooner?" "I did, as soon as I found out. But by the time I got to Montana, the court case was already over. I heard you'd been placed with Mr. Crow, and I—" He paused, his voice breaking. "I wanted to make sure you were safe, that you were being taken care of." Noah studied him for a long moment, then looked up at Silas. "Can we talk to him? Just for a little while?" Silas wanted to say no. Every instinct told him this man was a threat, another person who might try to take Noah away. But he saw the question in the boy's eyes, the need to understand where he came from, and he forced himself to nod. "We'll talk," Silas said, "but on the porch, where I can keep an eye on you." They sat together on the porch steps, Noah in the middle, Silas and Reed on either side. Reed talked for a long time, telling stories about Noah's father, about the family they'd come from, about the land that had caused so much trouble. He was honest about the rift between him and his brother, about the regret he'd carried for years, about the way he'd failed to be there when it mattered. Noah listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Reed finally fell silent, the boy spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "I appreciate you coming, I do. But I don't need you to take care of me. I've got that already." Reed's face fell, but he nodded. "I understand. I'm not here to take you away, Noah. I can see that you're in good hands, but I'd like to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Not as a guardian, Mr. Crow has that covered, but as family. Someone you can write to, someone who'll be there if you ever need anything." Noah glanced at Silas, who gave a slight nod. The boy turned back to Reed. "I can do that. But this is my home. Mr. Crow is my family now. That's not going to change." "I wouldn't want it to," Reed said, and the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. They talked for another hour, and by the time Reed climbed back into his wagon to head into town for the night, something had shifted. Silas still didn't trust the man completely, but he could see that Reed's intentions were genuine. And more importantly, Noah seemed at peace with it. That night, after Reed had gone and the ranch was quiet again, Noah sat at the kitchen table with Silas, his expression thoughtful. "Are you upset?" the boy asked. "About my uncle?" "No," Silas said honestly. "It's good that you have other family out there, people who care about you." "But you're still my family. You're still my pa." Silas reached across the table and gripped the boy's hand. "Always. That's never going to change no matter who else comes into your life." Noah smiled and the last shadow of worry lifted from his face. Winter came again, as it always did, but this time it felt different. The house was warmer, the days less lonely, and the work more purposeful. Silas taught Noah how to prepare for the cold months, how to stockpile feed and repair equipment before the snow came. They spent the long evenings by the fire, Silas reading aloud from books he'd kept packed away for years, Noah carving or mending tack. On Christmas Eve, Silas surprised Noah with a gift, a new saddle, custom-made and fitted for the boy's growing frame. Noah's eyes went wide when he saw it, and he ran his hands over the leather with something close to reverence. "It's too much," the boy said, his voice choked. "It's exactly what you need," Silas replied. "You're part of this ranch now, and you need your own gear." Noah threw his arms around Silas, holding on tight, and Silas returned the embrace, his own chest tight with emotion. That night, as they sat by the fire, Noah pulled something from his pocket and handed it to Silas. It was a small wooden carving of a man and a boy, standing side by side, the details so fine Silas could make out the lines on their faces. "I wanted you to have something," Noah said softly, "so you'd remember." "Remember what?" "That I'm here, that you're not alone anymore." Silas stared at the carving, his vision blurring, and he set it carefully on the mantel beside the little horse Noah had made months ago. "I won't forget, son. I promise." The years passed, as years do, and the ranch grew. Noah grew too, shooting up several inches and filling out into a strong young man with steady hands and a good heart. He learned everything Silas had to teach him, and then some, developing his own ideas about how to manage the land, how to breed better stock, how to build for the future. When Noah turned 18, the court released his inheritance from the trust. The land in the Eastern Territories was his to do with as he pleased. He sold it without hesitation, using the money to buy additional pasture adjoining Silas's ranch and to build a new barn. The rest he put away, saving it for someday. People in town had taken to calling them Silas and Noah Crow, father and son, and neither of them corrected the assumption. Because that's what they were, in every way that mattered. Not by blood, not by law originally, but by choice. By the daily decision to show up, to work side by side, to care for each other through the hard times and the good. One spring evening, nearly 5 years after Noah had first appeared in the barn doorway, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. The ranch stretched out before them, the cattle grazing peacefully, the fields green with new grass. Noah was 20 now, a man grown, but he still sat beside Silas the same way he had as a boy, shoulder to shoulder, comfortable in the silence. "You ever regret it?" Noah asked suddenly. "Taking me in that day?" Silas looked at him, at the strong young man he'd become, and felt a swell of pride so fierce it nearly took his breath away. "Not for a single moment." "Even with all the trouble I brought?" "Especially because of that. Fighting for you reminded me what it meant to have something worth fighting for. You gave me back my life, Noah. You gave me back a reason to live it." Noah's eyes glistened, and he reached over, gripping Silas's shoulder. "You saved mine." "We saved each other," Silas said. "That's what family does." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of sage and earth and home. And in that moment, Silas knew with absolute certainty that everything he'd lost, everything he'd grieved, had led him to this place, to this boy, to this life they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. Years later, when travelers would ask how Silas Crow and his son had built such a successful ranch, the old man would always smile and tell them the same story. About a boy who'd appeared one morning asking for work, about the choice to let him stay, about the fight to keep him, and about the family they'd become. Not because the law said so or because blood demanded it, but because they'd chosen each other when no one else would. And he'd always end the story the same way, his weathered hand resting on Noah's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. Sometimes the family you find is stronger than the family you're born with. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is a place to belong. And sometimes when you open your door to a stranger, you find exactly what you've been missing all along. Noah would nod, his own hand coming up to rest over his father's, and together they'd look out over the land they'd built, the life they'd created, the future they'd secured. Not perfect, not without its scars, but theirs. Completely and irrevocably theirs. And that in the end was more than enough.